The Denver International Airport was already buzzing with the chaotic energy of a Tuesday morning when Margaret Hayes walked through the sliding glass doors. She carried only a small leather carry-on bag, practical, worn, unremarkable. Everything about her was designed to be unremarkable. Her clothing was a masterclass in invisibility. Dark jeans that had lost their sheen years ago, a gray sweater from a Target clearance rack, and a brown jacket that could have belonged to any woman over 50 in America. Her shoes were practical walking sneakers, the kind that accumulated in discount bins at outlet stores. But it was her face that truly told the story of someone who had learned to disappear. Margaret stood in line at the ticket counter, her sunglasses already in place despite the fluorescent interior lighting. The oversized frames were designer, or had been 30 years ago, and now they screamed neither wealth nor poverty, but rather a woman who preferred not to be seen. Her baseball cap, navy blue and faded, bore no logo or branding, just the generic blue that thousands of people wore daily. She'd bought it at a gas station in Nebraska 2 years ago, and it had become a permanent fixture, a talisman against recognition. "Which flight today?" the airline clerk asked, not looking up from her computer screen. "Flight 447 to Washington, D.C., Margaret replied quietly. "One-way ticket first class." The clerk's fingers paused momentarily. One-way tickets always made them pause, but a woman paying cash in full for first class was a paying customer, not a concern. The clerk processed the transaction without comment, barely glancing at the driver's license Margaret slid across the counter. The name on it read Margaret Rebecca Hayes, with an address in Portland, Oregon. The photo was recent enough, 5 years old, showing a woman with tired eyes and resigned shoulders. The clerk stamped the boarding pass and handed it back. "Boarding begins at 10:15, gate B12. Margaret didn't smile. She never smiled at strangers. Smiles were memorable. Smiles made people think they knew you, that they'd seen you before. She simply nodded, collected her boarding pass, and turned away from the counter. The Denver airport was crowded with the typical Tuesday morning crowd. Business travelers in dark suits checking their phones every 3 seconds, families with young children weaving through crowds, elderly couples moving slowly with wheeled luggage that had seen better days. Margaret moved through them like water, present but unnoticed. She'd perfected this skill over 3 decades. The art of being in a place without being remembered as having been there. She found a quiet corner near a coffee shop and sat, her carry-on bag between her feet. From her jacket pocket she withdrew a worn journal and a pen. Not to write, she never left written records anymore, but to have something to occupy her hands, something to justify her stillness. Around her the airport moved with purposeful energy. People talked on phones. Children cried. Announcements echoed through speakers. Margaret observed it all with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary about a species to which she no longer belonged. At 9:45 she purchased a bottle of water, not coffee, which stained teeth and created identification markers, and made her way through security. The TSA agent scanned her ID without really seeing her. She removed her shoes, her belt, placed her bag on the conveyor belt. The body scanner found nothing unusual, nothing hidden, nothing worthy of note. She collected her belongings and moved forward. Gate B12 was already crowded with passengers waiting for boarding to begin. Margaret found a seat in a far corner, between a businessman reading the Wall Street Journal and a woman with 2 small children. She settled into the plastic chair, pulling her cap slightly lower, and watched the gate agent busily preparing for the boarding process. This flight was intentional. Every detail of this day had been calculated with the precision of a military operation, because that's what it was. Margaret had spent weeks studying Captain James Mitchell's schedule. She'd learned he flew this route every Tuesday. She'd purchased a ticket specifically for this flight on this date in this seat. 8A was first class, the window seat on the left side of the aircraft. She'd chosen it deliberately. When the gate agent announced, "We begin boarding first-class passengers in 2 minutes," Margaret gathered her belongings and joined the growing line. She handed her boarding pass to the agent, a young woman with bright red lipstick who smiled warmly. Margaret nodded without returning the smile and walked down the jet bridge. The interior of the Boeing 737 was pristine, with plush carpet and cream-colored seats. The flight attendants greeted passengers with professional warmth as they boarded. "Welcome, ma'am," one said as Margaret passed. Margaret simply moved forward, counting seats until she reached 8A, the window seat, the perfect seat. She settled into the leather chair, which was still cool from having just been cleaned. The flight attendant approached with a beverage cart before takeoff. "Can I get you anything before we push back?" "Black coffee, please," Margaret said quietly. "No sugar, no cream." The flight attendant returned moments later with a small cup of hot coffee and a biscotti. Margaret accepted both, though she wouldn't eat the biscotti. She held the warm cup instead, letting it warm her hands, hands that hadn't been still in years, that always needed something to occupy them, some small anchor to the present moment. Through the window beside her, Margaret could see the runway stretching endlessly into the distance. She thought about distance, how much of it she'd covered in her life, how many miles she'd traveled to stay away from where she'd come from. She thought about the 737 that would soon lift into the sky, carrying her toward Washington, D.C., toward a meeting she'd orchestrated with the precision of a classified military operation. Around her, other first-class passengers settled in. A businessman worked on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. A woman in a business suit made a phone call, confirming a meeting time. A retired couple held hands, talking softly about their grandchildren waiting for them in the nation's capital. Normal people living normal lives. Margaret envied them the simplicity of that, the ability to be remembered, to accumulate a history that belonged to them. She sipped her coffee and watched the ground crew prepare the aircraft for departure. Her heart beat steadily, no faster than normal. There was no anxiety, no fear, only purpose. Only the knowledge that after 30 years of being dead, officially dead, legally dead, socially dead, she was finally about to step back into her own life. The engines began to rumble. The announcement came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Flight 447 to Washington, D.C. We're preparing for departure. Please ensure your seatbelt is fastened." Margaret fastened her seatbelt and waited. The wheels began to move, and the aircraft pushed back from the gate. She closed her eyes and felt the acceleration, felt the nose of the plane lift, felt gravity release its grip as they climbed into the sky. She was going home. Captain James Mitchell had been flying for 28 years. He'd experienced every type of weather phenomenon, navigated through thunderstorms that looked like the sky was breaking apart, descended through fog so thick you couldn't see your own wingtip. He'd learned to manage fear the way other people managed emotions, with technique, with discipline, with the knowledge that panic killed pilots faster than any mechanical failure. But 30 years of being taught to control fear, to suppress it, to transform it into calculated risk assessment, couldn't prepare him for what he felt when he looked at the weather radar that Tuesday morning. The storm had materialized too quickly. The meteorological reports from 30 minutes ago had shown clear skies all the way to Washington, D.C., but the atmosphere was unstable, and nature didn't always cooperate with predictions. Now, as Flight 447 climbed to cruising altitude, James watched the radar screen with growing concern. There was a line of thunderstorms developing directly in their flight path, cells growing darker and more violent by the minute. It was the kind of storm that made experienced pilots hold their breath. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 447, James spoke into his headset. "We're showing severe weather developing along our planned route, requesting alternative routing to the north." The response came back tinged with static. "Copy that, 447. We're showing the same cells. Reroute approved. Climb to flight level 350. James banked the aircraft slightly northward, increasing the climb rate. First Officer Sandra Chen beside him remained focused, monitoring instruments with the calm competence of someone who'd trained for emergencies 1,000 times. Everything was under control. Everything was procedure. Everything was fine. Until it wasn't. They hit the first turbulent air pocket at 28,000 feet. It wasn't violent, just a slight jolt, the kind that made coffee cups rattle in the galley. James had experienced worse, but then came another, and another. The aircraft bucked like something alive, like a wild horse throwing a rider. The autopilot struggled to maintain altitude as invisible air currents grabbed the plane and shook it with increasing violence. "Cabin pressure is nominal," Sandra reported, her voice steady despite the shaking. "All systems green." But the storm wasn't cooperating. The cells had shifted. The jet stream had accelerated. What should have been a smooth route around the weather had somehow placed them directly in the most violent part of the system. The aircraft dove suddenly, then rose sharply, then twisted to the left. Behind them, James heard the sound every pilot dreads, the unmistakable sound of panic from the cabin. Screams, a child crying, the crash of luggage from the overhead bins, the distinct sound of someone getting sick in the lavatory. This wasn't the normal turbulence that came with flying. This was severe weather, the kind that made people question their decision to fly at all. "I'm declaring an emergency descent," James announced to air traffic control, "descending to 25,000 feet for weather avoidance." "Copy that 447. You're cleared to descend. Emergency services standing by." The aircraft banked sharply and James felt the nose tilt downward. They were dropping altitude fast. The turbulence continued, but it was slightly less violent at the lower altitude. Still rough, still unsettling, but manageable. James made a decision that violated protocol. He needed to assess the cabin situation. "Sandra, you have the controls," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Captain, you should stay in the cockpit during." "I know, just maintain our descent, I'll be quick." James opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. What he saw was controlled chaos. A flight attendant was helping a passenger who'd hit his head on the overhead compartment, blood trickling down his forehead. Another passenger was gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles had turned white. A woman with 2 children was trying to comfort the children while fighting her own obvious terror. And in the middle of this pandemonium, James's eyes locked on seat 8A. The woman in seat 8A was perfectly still. While every other passenger was either screaming, crying, praying, or gripping their seatbelt like it was a lifeline, the woman in 8A sat with perfect posture, her hands resting on the armrests, not gripping, not tensing, but resting with the calm of someone who'd made peace with death long ago. Her head was tilted slightly, and through the oversized sunglasses, James could somehow sense her assessing the situation with absolute clarity. Then she did something that no civilian passenger would do. She checked the seatbelt configuration of the passenger next to her, the businessman who was hyperventilating, and subtly adjusted it to ensure he was properly secured. She leaned over and spoke something to him, something James couldn't hear over the roar of the engines and the continuing sounds of distress. But her voice had a quality to it, something measured, something authoritative, something that instantly calmed the man's visible panic. James froze. Every cell in his body suddenly screamed with recognition. That wasn't possible. The aircraft hit another severe air pocket, and James braced himself against the nearest seat. But his eyes remained locked on seat 8A. The woman turned her head slightly, as if sensing his gaze. For just a moment, no more than a second, their eyes might have met through the sunglasses. Then she looked away, toward the window, with the kind of practiced indifference that only someone with military training could achieve. "No, it couldn't be." "Captain, you need to return to the cockpit," the head flight attendant called out, concern etched on her face. "Right, yes, I'm coming," James replied automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. He returned to the cockpit and sat back in his seat, his hands gripping the controls with more tension than necessary. Sandra glanced at him. "Everything okay back there?" Yeah, passenger hit his head. Nothing serious. Status report. Weather clearing to the south. We can resume normal altitude in about 5 minutes. James nodded, but his mind was racing. The woman's posture, the way she'd moved, the absolute calm in her voice when she'd spoken to the panicking businessman, the military bearing, everything about her screamed pilot, screamed military, screamed something that made his chest tight with impossible recognition. As they climbed back to cruising altitude and the turbulence subsided to normal levels, James kept his focus on the flight. But once they were settled and on autopilot, once there were no more decisions to make, once the emergency was officially over, he did something he'd never done while flying. He reached into his flight bag beneath his seat and pulled out his encrypted phone. It violated protocol to use personal devices in the cockpit during flight. It was a fireable offense if discovered, but James needed to know. His hands trembled as he navigated to the classified military database he still had access to, a security clearance he maintained from his years flying for the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. He typed in a call sign, just one word. Phoenix. The database took a moment to load. When it did, James felt his heart stop completely. There was a photograph, black and white from 1993. A woman in military uniform, aviator sunglasses pushed up on her forehead, jet black hair pulled back in regulation style. Colonel Sarah Phoenix Bennett, the photograph read, decorated pilot, Distinguished Flying Cross, Medal of Valor, status, killed in action 1993 Bosnia. The woman in the photograph and the woman in seat 8A were unmistakably the same person. James stared at the screen until the turbulence of his thoughts matched the turbulence of the air that had just shaken the aircraft. Dead for 30 years. That's what the record said. That's what they'd all believed. But Phoenix was sitting in first class, 45 rows behind him, very much alive. And she'd taken this flight deliberately. James Mitchell was 26 years old when he first met Colonel Sarah Phoenix Bennett. He was a young first lieutenant, fresh from flight school, assigned to the 522nd Fighter Squadron at Aviano Air Base in Italy. The squadron was preparing for deployment to Bosnia, where the conflict was escalating and military intervention seemed inevitable. He was nervous, ambitious, and terrified that he'd somehow fail to live up to the expectations placed on a military pilot. Phoenix arrived to take command of the squadron on a cold January morning in 1993. She was 42 years old at the time, already a legend in Air Force circles, a pilot with more combat hours than most senior officers, a woman who'd broken barriers in a male-dominated culture, a flying instructor who'd trained some of the Air Force's finest. But what struck James immediately wasn't her resume. It was her presence. She walked into the briefing room that morning with a quiet authority that made every pilot sit up straighter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply commanded the space by being in it. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent, penetrating, seemed to assess every pilot in that room and find them simultaneously capable and in need of improvement. "You're all good pilots," she'd said that first day. "Some of you are very good, but none of you are as good as you think you are, and that's perfect, because I'm going to make you better. I'm going to teach you that being a pilot isn't about proving yourself. It's about protecting the person flying on your wing. That's everything. That's the only mission that matters." James had believed her then. He believed her now. The deployment to Bosnia came 3 months later. The squadron was tasked with providing air support for peacekeeping operations and reconnaissance missions. The conflict was brutal, unpredictable, and dangerous. By June 1993, the 522nd had already lost 2 aircraft, one pilot confirmed dead, another still missing. It was during this period that James witnessed what would define the rest of his understanding of leadership and courage. A routine reconnaissance mission had gone badly wrong. James was part of a 4-aircraft formation searching for suspected military positions. What they found instead was an ambush. 2 of the helicopters, supporting aircraft for the mission, were hit by ground fire. Pilots radioed that they had casualties. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Ground forces radioed that they were pinned down, unable to extract the wounded without air support. Protocol said to radio for backup, to wait for proper support elements to arrive, to follow established procedures. Protocol was safe. Protocol was sensible. Protocol would save lives by avoiding unnecessary risk. Phoenix was flying the lead helicopter that day. "I'm going in," she'd radioed, her voice calm as glass. "All other aircraft maintain current altitude and provide suppression fire." "Negative, Phoenix," the commanding general radioed back from the command center. "I repeat, negative. That's a direct order. Stand down." There was a pause. James remembered that pause. In it, he understood that he was about to witness either an act of heroic disobedience or a court-martial. "Roger that order," Phoenix replied, understood and acknowledged. Another pause, then, "I'm disregarding it." Her helicopter descended sharply, diving toward the ground fire despite the fact that incoming rounds were visible even from James's altitude. She landed in a hot zone, an area under active fire, with no support, no backup plan, and no guarantee of survival. James watched from above, his hands shaking on the controls as Phoenix ran out of her helicopter into the chaos below. She extracted 2 wounded soldiers, supporting their weight as she moved through incoming fire. Rounds hit the helicopter behind her. The rotor blades caught a ricochet, but she kept moving, kept running, kept pulling people toward safety. She got both soldiers back to her helicopter, along with 3 ground personnel who'd been pinned down. Then her helicopter wouldn't start. The mechanical failure came at the worst possible moment. The rotor wouldn't engage. She'd landed in a hot zone, extracted wounded, and now her extraction was failing. Another aircraft moved in to provide additional suppression fire. Phoenix abandoned the helicopter, gathered the wounded soldiers she'd rescued, and guided them toward a Humvee operated by ground forces that was racing toward them. She was running with a wounded soldier over her shoulder when her helicopter, the one she'd flown, the one she'd risked everything in, took a direct hit. It exploded in a ball of fire behind her, sending shrapnel across the ground. One piece caught her in the left leg, but she didn't stop. She got the wounded soldier to safety, collapsed on the ground, and refused medical evacuation until every other wounded person had been treated first. She'd lost her leg that day. Not literally. The surgeon saved it, though she'd spent months in recovery. But she'd lost something else. She'd lost the thing that mattered most to a pilot, her career. The injury was severe enough that she was medically retired 2 months later. By September 1993, Phoenix was no longer flying. By November 1993, she was dead. The official story came through channels that James still didn't fully understand. Phoenix had accepted a special assignment. The details were classified, the specifics compartmentalized. She was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission when her aircraft was shot down over enemy territory. Search and rescue operations had recovered nothing. No survivors, no wreckage, no remains. She was presumed dead. The memorial service at Arlington Cemetery was held on a cold November afternoon. The entire squadron attended. James stood with hundreds of other military personnel, watching as a flag-draped casket was lowered into the ground. Except everyone knew, in the way that military people know classified information through whispers and careful implications, that there was no body in that casket. There was no Phoenix to bury. Her mother wept. Her father stood rigid, grief compressed into military bearing. Her younger sister, the only family member who seemed to understand that this death was manufactured, stared at the casket with an expression of quiet fury. James had wept too, not because he believed she was dead. Something in his instinct said she wasn't, but because whatever she was now, whatever she'd become, she was lost to him. She was gone from the world she'd lived in, gone from the people who loved her, gone from the career she'd defined herself through. 30 years had passed. 30 years of James living a normal life, becoming a commercial pilot, accumulating a respectable career, falling into the comfortable routine of a man who'd made peace with his past. He'd thought about Phoenix occasionally, the way you think about important people you've lost, but he'd accepted the memorial service as closure. He'd mourned her and moved on. Now, holding his encrypted phone with Phoenix's photograph on the screen, James confronted the impossible reality. The military hadn't lost her. They'd erased her, officially declared her dead for some reason that remained classified, and she'd lived in the shadows for 30 years. And now she was sitting in seat 8A. James's hands shook as he closed the encrypted phone and placed it back in his flight bag. Around him, the cockpit hummed with the normal sounds of cruising flight. Sandra was monitoring instruments. The autopilot was managing the aircraft with perfect precision. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Except for the fact that a dead pilot was sitting in first class, and James had no idea what to do about it. He had a choice to make: report it, as protocol demanded, or honor the debt he owed to a woman who'd once risked everything to save people she barely knew. A woman who'd sacrificed 30 years of her life for reasons James would probably never understand. The aircraft continued toward Washington, D.C., carrying James toward a decision that would change both their lives. The landing at Washington Dulles International Airport was textbook perfect, smooth, controlled, exactly as it should be after a 4-hour flight. The wheels touched down at 2:47 p.m., and James guided the aircraft toward the terminal with the precision that came from thousands of landings. Everything was professional. Everything was routine. Everything was normal except for the fact that his entire world had shifted on its axis. For the past 3 hours and 52 minutes, James had wrestled with his decision. He'd sat in the cockpit, managing the flight, communicating with air traffic control, making all the decisions required of a captain. But his mind had been elsewhere, trapped in a loop of impossible choices. Report her, that's what duty demanded, that's what protocol required, that's what he should do. But duty and protocol had led to her being erased in the first place. Duty and protocol had led to a memorial service for someone who wasn't actually dead. Duty and protocol had taken a hero and turned her into a ghost. As the aircraft pulled into the gate and the engines wound down, James made his final decision. He would talk to her, face to face. Before anything else happened, before any reports were filed, before the machinery of military bureaucracy cranked into motion, he would look into her eyes and understand what she wanted, what she needed, why she'd taken this flight. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his legs slightly unsteady. First Officer Sandra Chin glanced at him. "Good flight, Captain. Smooth recovery from that turbulence." "Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Standard debrief in 20 minutes. "You got it." James left the cockpit and walked toward the passenger cabin. This violated protocol. Captains didn't normally leave the cockpit while passengers were deplaning. But James had already violated protocol by checking classified databases on his personal phone. One more violation seemed almost trivial now. The first-class cabin was crowded with people gathering their belongings, eager to exit the aircraft after the turbulent flight. A businessman was already on his phone, confirming he'd arrived safely. The retired couple was collecting their small bags from the overhead compartment. Children were running up and down the aisle, relieved to be on the ground. And there, methodically gathering her leather carry-on bag from beneath the seat in front of her, was the woman in 8A. She was standing now, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who was never in a rush. Her baseball cap was still in place. Her sunglasses still covered her eyes. But there was something different about her posture now. She seemed to vibrate with a subtle tension, as if she'd been waiting for this moment and was ready for it. James moved toward her, his captain's uniform suddenly feeling like armor and a liability simultaneously. His heart was pounding in his chest with an intensity he hadn't experienced since combat training decades ago. Around them, other passengers moved and spoke, completely unaware that something momentous was about to occur. The woman looked up as he approached. She didn't seem surprised. She simply waited, standing in the narrow aisle, her carry-on bag held at her side. James's mouth was dry. His hands wanted to shake, so he clasped them in front of him. All of his training, all of his experience, all of his professional composure crystallized into this single moment. He looked directly at her, even though he couldn't quite see her eyes behind those sunglasses. "Seat 8A, he said quietly, using his captain's voice, the one trained to project authority and calm to be heard without shouting. "Identify yourself." The cabin fell silent. It wasn't a complete silence. Conversations didn't instantly stop. Children didn't freeze. Luggage continued to shift. But there was a quality of attention that sharpened in the air. Other passengers sensed that something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand what. The woman in 8A tilted her head slightly, as if assessing him. She slowly removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were exactly as James remembered them, sharp, intelligent, penetrating. But they held something else now, a kind of resignation mixed with relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for 30 years and was finally about to exhale. "Captain," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "I think you already know." "I need to hear it," James replied. "I need to hear it out loud." For a moment the woman was perfectly still. Around them, a businessman paused in his packing. A flight attendant straightened up, sensing that something was happening but not understanding what. The noise of the airport outside seemed to fade away, leaving just this moment, captain and passenger, standing in the narrow aisle of an aircraft, with the weight of 30 years between them. The woman reached up and removed her baseball cap. Her hair, silver gray now, fell slightly around her shoulders. She was smaller than James remembered her being. Age and 30 years of invisibility had diminished her physical stature. But when she looked at him directly, when her full face was revealed, she was unmistakably exactly who she'd always been. "Phoenix," she said simply. "Colonel Sarah Bennett, call sign Phoenix." A flight attendant gasped. A passenger dropped a coffee cup. The businessman stared openly, but James barely noticed them. His eyes were locked on hers, and everything he'd repressed for 30 years suddenly surfaced. The grief he'd felt at her memorial service, the confusion about her disappearance, the anger at a military system that sacrificed heroes and then erased them. "Oh God," he whispered. "Don't," she said immediately, her voice firm. "Don't make this about emotion. Not yet. We don't have time for emotion right now." Her tone was pure command. Even after 30 years, even diminished by time and circumstance, she still possessed the authority to order people around. And James, still a young first lieutenant in his heart despite the captain's bars on his uniform, obeyed. "Why?" he asked instead. "Why now? Why this flight?" "Because I chose to," she replied. "Because I'm tired of being dead. Because if I didn't do this now, I never would." She paused, and for a moment, emotion did crack through her controlled exterior. "And because I needed to know if there was someone in this world who'd recognize me, who'd remember, who wouldn't turn away." "I would never," James started. "I know," she interrupted. "That's why I chose your flight." Around them, the other passengers had realized something extraordinary was happening. A young woman was filming on her phone. The businessman was staring with dawning recognition. A mother was pulling her children closer, unsure if they should witness whatever this was. "We need to move," Phoenix said, her military efficiency returning. "Off this aircraft, away from cameras. I have a hotel room reserved. We have a lot to talk about, Captain Mitchell. 30 years of talking to do." James nodded, still stunned, still processing. He gestured for her to precede him toward the exit. As she moved past him, she paused for just a second. Her hand briefly touched his arm, the first physical contact they'd had in 30 years. "Thank you for flying me home," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure anyone would." Then she moved forward, down the aisle toward the jet bridge, toward the airport terminal, toward whatever came next. And James followed, his entire world reorganized around the impossible fact that Phoenix was alive and walking off an airplane at Dulles International Airport, where 300 people with phones and cameras could document the moment the dead came back to life. The airport lounge was nearly empty at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Most travelers were either still in transit or had already reached their destinations. It was a neutral space, professional and anonymous, the kind of place where two people could sit and speak without drawing attention. James had suggested it because it was public enough to feel safe, but private enough for the conversation they needed to have. Sarah Phoenix, Colonel Sarah Bennett, Margaret Hayes, sat across from him at a small table in the corner, a cup of black coffee untouched between them. She'd kept her cap off, her sunglasses in her jacket pocket. She looked different without them, older, more vulnerable, and somehow more real. Up close, in natural light, James could see the cost of 30 years written across her face. The lines around her eyes spoke of decades of tension. Her hands, which had once been steady enough to fly a helicopter through a thunderstorm, trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked quietly. "The beginning," James replied. "The real beginning. What happened after you left the hospital in 1993? Sarah took a breath, and for a moment she was somewhere else entirely. Back in 1993, back in a medical facility in Germany, back in the moment when her entire life fractured. "The injury was severe," she began. "The surgeon said I'd never fly again. I'd already accepted that. I knew when I climbed out of that helicopter in Bosnia that my flying days were finished. I'd made peace with it. But then, 3 weeks after I was transferred to Germany, 2 men in dark suits came to my hospital room. No names, no official identification, just men who represented something classified and powerful." She paused, her fingers gripping the coffee cup tighter. "They told me I'd been selected for a special operation, a classified extraction of a CIA asset behind enemy lines. The asset was a Serbian general who defected, someone who had information critical to U.S. intelligence interests. The operation was deniable, meaning if anything went wrong, the government would deny any involvement. I was told I could refuse, but I was also told that if I refused, my situation would be complicated." "Your situation?" James asked. "They meant my future, my career, my ability to live a normal life. The implication was clear: cooperate and I'd be taken care of. Refuse and things would become difficult. So I said yes because I was still a soldier and soldiers follow orders." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, though she didn't seem to taste it. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something only she could see. "The mission went wrong from the beginning. The extraction point was compromised. The asset was never at the location where we were supposed to meet him. We were walking into an ambush and we didn't know it until we were already surrounded. The team I was with, 6 of us, we fought our way out, but we were separated. I ended up alone, and that's when they got me." James felt his chest tighten. He'd never asked what happened after her helicopter was shot down. He'd accepted the official story: killed in action, presumed dead. The idea that she'd been captured, that she'd suffered beyond the injury in Bosnia, was something he'd never let himself fully contemplate. "I was detained at a facility that still isn't officially acknowledged," Sarah continued. "No Red Cross visits, no official government records. I was one of dozens of people kept there during the Cold War's final gasps. 18 months, James. 18 months of interrogation, isolation, and the distinct possibility that no one even knew I was alive." "My God," James whispered. The interrogations weren't physical mostly. They were psychological. They wanted to know everything: Air Force protocols, classified technologies, information about other operations. They wanted me to break, to give them something they could use or trade. And eventually I realized something: I was worth more alive than dead. I was a bargaining chip in a larger game I didn't fully understand. She finally looked away from the distance and met James's eyes. In 1994, there was a prisoner exchange. 3 American operatives for 8 Serbian prisoners. I was one of the 3, but here's where it gets complicated. The State Department negotiated my release, but they also negotiated my erasure. The official story was that I'd been killed in action. There was a memorial service at Arlington. My family was told I was dead, and in exchange for my life, I agreed to disappear. You agreed to that? James asked, struggling to understand. I didn't have much choice. They explained it to me very carefully. If I went back to active duty, if I tried to resume my old life, it would expose the CIA's detention programs. It would compromise other operations. It would create legal and diplomatic problems the government wasn't prepared to handle. But if I simply vanished, if I became a ghost, then everything could be buried. They gave me a new identity, Margaret Hayes, and a social security number that would survive scrutiny. They set me up with enough money to live quietly for the rest of my life. James listened to all of this without interrupting, understanding with growing clarity the trap she'd been placed in. "Why didn't you fight it?" he asked gently. "Why didn't you go public?" "With what?" Sarah replied, her voice harder now. "I was one person. The people who detained me were powerful. The government that negotiated my release was powerful, and they made one thing very clear. If I tried to expose the operation, if I tried to tell my story, my family would be prosecuted. My mother, my father, my sister, they'd all be implicated in conspiracy, in violation of classified information laws. They'd be destroyed, so I took the deal. I became Margaret Hayes, and Sarah Bennett became a memorial plaque at Arlington." She stopped and looked directly at James, and he could see the 30-year-old wound still bleeding underneath her controlled exterior. "I became a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon," she said quietly. "I taught American history to teenagers who would never know that the woman in front of them had actually lived it. I taught about the Constitution and individual rights while having no real identity. I taught about freedom while being a prisoner of my own erasure. And every single day for 30 years, I woke up and accepted this as the cost of my survival." "Until today," James said. "Until today," she confirmed. "Because I realized something after 30 years. I wasn't protecting my family by staying silent. I was just continuing the work of the people who detained me. They'd won. They'd broken me into silence. And I was never going to reclaim my life if I kept accepting their version of what was best for me." She picked up her coffee cup again, holding it between her hands like it was the only thing anchoring her to this moment. "I researched you," she said. "I kept track of a few people from my old life very carefully. I knew you became a commercial airline pilot. I found your flight schedule. And I decided that if I was going to do this, if I was finally going to break 30 years of silence, it would be with someone who actually knew who I was. Someone who'd remember Phoenix. Someone who wouldn't run away when they realized what they were looking at." "I would never," James started. "I know," she interrupted gently. "That's why I chose you." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of history pressing down on both of them. Outside the lounge, the normal world continued. People rushed to gates. Announcements echoed through speakers. The machinery of modern travel continued its endless operation. But in this quiet corner, 2 people sat with the truth that had been buried for 30 years. "What happens now?" James finally asked. Sarah set down her coffee cup and met his eyes with the same steady gaze that had led a helicopter into enemy fire all those decades ago. "Now," she said, "I take back my life, and I'm going to tell my story. Not to hurt the people who protected me, they were following orders too, but to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. Will you help me?" James didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "whatever you need." Sarah reached across the table and gripped his hand, the first deliberate touch since they'd left the aircraft. Her grip was strong, steady, and filled with gratitude for something as simple as being believed. "Thank you," she said. Thank you for remembering who I was when the whole world was pretending I never existed. James Mitchell didn't sleep that night. He sat in his hotel room in Arlington, Virginia, watching the city lights blur and shift outside his window, wrestling with the most significant moral decision of his life. Sarah had given him her hotel information and told him to sleep on it, to let everything settle before making any choices. But sleep was impossible. The decision was simple on the surface. Report her to the Department of Defense and follow the law, or keep her secret and become complicit in her continued erasure. But underneath that simple binary lay layers of impossible complexity. If he reported her, he would be doing his duty as a military officer. The regulations were clear. A missing service person, officially declared deceased, suddenly discovered to be alive. This absolutely had to be reported. Protocol existed for a reason. The system depended on officers following orders, following procedures, following the chain of command. It was the foundation that held the military together. But that same system had erased her. That same system had lied about her death. That same protocol had destroyed her life and replaced it with a fiction. And the military officers who'd done this, the ones who'd made the decision to erase her, they'd done it in the name of national security and political convenience. James opened his laptop and tried to do something he'd been avoiding. He searched online for anything related to classified prisoner exchanges in 1994. The search results were frustratingly thin. Declassified documents were scarce. News articles from that period provided only the vaguest references to undisclosed exchanges and repatriated personnel. The government had clearly done a thorough job of burying Sarah's story. He tried searching for Sarah's memorial service. There it was. Arlington National Cemetery, November 1993, Colonel Sarah Elizabeth Bennett, killed in action in Bosnia. A small notice in the Arlington newsletter. A mention in an Air Force newsletter from that month. A few sentences in a book about women in the military that treated her as a historical footnote rather than a real person. The military had killed her so thoroughly that bringing her back would be like trying to resurrect a ghost. Around midnight, James made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't fully predict. He called General Raymond Harrison. The number was in his memory from decades ago, a number he'd never expected to use but had somehow retained. A general doesn't change phone numbers often, and Harrison had retired just 5 years ago. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Who the hell is calling at midnight?" "General Harrison, this is Captain James Mitchell. I apologize for the hour, but I need to speak with you about something classified from 1993. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Where are you calling from?" "A hotel in Arlington. I need to know about Operation Phoenix Extract. I need to know what really happened." Another silence, longer this time. James could hear breathing, could sense the gears turning in a mind that had spent 50 years managing classified information and political landmines. "I'll be at the Lincoln Memorial in 30 minutes, Harrison said finally. "Come alone, tell no one." The drive took 20 minutes. James found General Harrison standing by the steps at 2 in the morning, a tall man in his 80s wearing a long overcoat, looking like a ghost himself. They walked together without speaking, their footsteps echoing in the empty night. "How much do you know?" Harrison asked finally. "She was on my flight today. Flight 447 to D.C. She sat in seat 8A. She identified herself to me. She told me the story of the extraction mission, the capture, the detention, the prisoner exchange. She told me about the deal, her life in exchange for silence and erasure." Harrison stopped walking and looked at James with eyes that carried the weight of classified knowledge spanning decades. "Everything she told you is true," he said. "I was part of the operation that negotiated her release. I was also part of the decision to erase her, and I've spent 30 years wondering if it was the right call." "It wasn't," James said quietly. "No," Harrison agreed. "It wasn't. But at the time, it seemed like the only way to save everyone, save the intelligence operations, save the detainees who were still being held, save her from prosecution if she went public. The men who detained her were never going to be held accountable. The operations that created the detention program were never going to be exposed. So we sacrificed her instead. We turned her into a martyr without even letting her have the dignity of being dead. They started walking again, moving toward the water, two old soldiers carrying the weight of decisions made in darkness. "What does she want?" Harrison asked. "To tell her story, to reclaim her identity, to stop being a ghost." Harrison nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this answer, as if part of him had been waiting 30 years for this moment. "If you report her," Harrison said, "the government will try to silence her again. Oh, it'll be nicer this time. There will be lawyers, agreements, probably a financial settlement. But the outcome will be the same. She'll be told that national security requires her continued silence. She'll be pressured into signing documents that prevent her from ever speaking publicly. She'll become a prisoner again, just in a more sophisticated way." "And if I don't report her?" James asked. "Then you become complicit in conspiracy against the United States government. You become liable for treason, for protecting a missing service person, for obstruction of justice. Your career ends. Your freedom is compromised. And she still might be discovered eventually, and everything gets worse for both of you." Harrison stopped and turned to face James directly. "So there is no good choice here, Captain. There's only the choice you can live with. I've had to make similar choices throughout my career. I've never been comfortable with any of them. But I've learned that sometimes honoring a person matters more than honoring a system that's proven itself fundamentally unjust." "What are you saying?" James asked. "I'm saying that if you choose to help her, I'll do everything in my power to protect both of you. I have contacts, I have knowledge, I have resources, and I have 30 years of guilt that I can finally do something about." James felt something shift in his chest, not relief exactly, but the weight of the decision becoming slightly more bearable. "She wants to write a memoir," James said. "She wants to tell her story publicly, with names changed, locations obscured, but the truth laid bare." "That's good," Harrison said. "That's the right thing. A memoir is memoir. It's personal narrative, it's protected speech. It's harder for the government to suppress than a direct accusation. If it's written carefully with good legal counsel, it can expose what happened without exposing active operations or putting other people at risk." They walked in silence for a while, the weight of Washington around them, the monuments to power, to history, to the machinery of government that had chewed up Sarah Bennett and spit her out as a ghost. "There's one more thing you should know," Harrison said. "The man who authorized her detention, the CIA operative who made the call to erase her after the prisoner exchange, he died 2 years ago. He took most of the details of what happened to his grave. Some of it will never be fully public, but Sarah's story is powerful even without the complete picture. It's powerful because it's true and because it's been silenced." At 3 a.m., James and Harrison parted ways at the Lincoln Memorial. The general gripped James's shoulder with surprising strength. "Protect her," he said, "not because it's right, though it is, not because it's just, though it might be, but because she spent 30 years protecting everyone else. It's time someone protected her." James drove back to his hotel. As dawn began to break over Washington, D.C., he had his answer now. He knew what he would do. He would not report Sarah Bennett to the Department of Defense. Instead, he would help her reclaim her life, tell her story, and finally, after 30 years, stop being a ghost. The cost would be high, but it was a price worth paying. 3 days after Flight 447 landed at Dulles, James received an email with the subject line, "Do you know this woman?" The email contained a link to a YouTube video that had been uploaded by someone with the username at Dulles Witness. The video showed the moment on the aircraft, James approaching seat 8A, his quiet conversation with the woman, her removal of her sunglasses and baseball cap. The video had 247,000 views. The comments section was a chaos of speculation. Some people recognized the military bearing, the captain's uniform, and assumed it was some kind of internal Air Force matter. Others speculated about terrorism, about security breaches, about classified operations. A few people mentioned the name Phoenix and referenced historical Air Force records, though most of those comments had been deleted or were buried under thousands of others. James called Sarah immediately. "Have you seen the video?" he asked without preamble. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I saw it 2 hours ago. I've been waiting for you to call." "What do we do? This is going to expose you. The Department of Defense is going to see this. They're going to start asking questions. We don't have time anymore for careful planning." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Sarah said something that changed everything. "Good." "What?" "Good that it's happening now. Good that the timeline is accelerated. I was getting tired of waiting anyway. James, I've spent 30 years waiting. I've waited for permission I was never going to get. I've waited for the right moment that never arrives. If the government is going to start paying attention regardless, I might as well get my story out first." James felt his chest tighten. "Sarah, you need to think about this carefully. You need legal counsel, you need—" "I have legal counsel," she interrupted. "I hired a firm this morning. 3 lawyers who specialize in government accountability and whistleblower protection. I've already given them the full story, and we've already started drafting my memoir." James realized that Sarah had been planning this all along. She'd been several steps ahead of him, anticipating the exposure, preparing for it, using it as a catalyst rather than a catastrophe. "When?" he asked. "The memoir will be ready for publication in 2 weeks. The lawyers are expediting everything. We're planning a press conference for the day before publication. Give the media time to process the story before the book hits shelves. I want you there, James. I want you to stand with me when I tell the world who I really am." 2 weeks, James repeated, the enormity of it crashing down on him. 2 weeks, Sarah confirmed, and then I'm finally going to be real again. The next week was a blur of complications and escalations. News outlets started picking up the airplane video. Military analysts and aviation enthusiasts began identifying the woman in Seat 8A from grainy video frames. There were think pieces about potential security breaches. There were op-eds about classified operations and government accountability. Someone dug up the 1993 Memorial Service records and started asking questions about why a supposedly killed-in-action pilot would be flying commercially 30 years later. And then, 5 days after the video surfaced, the Department of Defense issued an official statement. It was carefully worded, acknowledging that they were aware of certain claims being made about a classified Cold War-era operation, while refusing to confirm or deny specific details on national security grounds. The statement said that any discussion of such operations would require proper legal and legislative channels. It warned against the unauthorized disclosure of classified information and reminded all parties that violations of the Espionage Act carried severe criminal penalties. It was a threat delivered with bureaucratic politeness. James and Sarah met in the safe house that General Harrison had arranged for them, a secure location in the Shenandoah Valley, far enough from Washington to avoid casual surveillance, but close enough that Sarah's lawyers could commute for consultations. "They're trying to scare me into silence," Sarah said, showing James the official statement on her phone. "It's the same tactic they've always used. Make the threats sound official, make the consequences sound catastrophic, hope that fear will break you before you break the story." "Maybe we should listen," James said, though he didn't believe it. "Maybe there's a reason some information needs to stay classified." Sarah looked at him with something between pity and understanding. "James, I've spent 30 years telling myself that exact thing. I've told myself that the detention program needed to stay classified to protect intelligence operations. I've told myself that exposing it would endanger current personnel. I've told myself that silence was patriotic, but you know what I've learned? The only thing those secrets protect is the people who made the decisions. They don't protect the country. They don't protect the soldiers. They protect the system that erased me. She set down her phone and leaned forward. In my memoir, I'm not going to expose active operations. I'm not going to compromise current intelligence gathering. I'm not going to endanger anyone, but I am going to tell the truth about what happened to me. And if the government wants to prosecute me for that, then we'll see what a jury thinks about whether the government has the right to erase someone and then punish them for refusing to stay erased. Over the next week, James watched Sarah transform. The invisible woman who'd been hiding in Portland slowly became Phoenix again, not the young pilot from 1993, but something different. A woman who'd survived erasure and was determined to make it mean something. They worked on the memoir together, with James providing historical context, verifying details, asking the hard questions that readers would ask. Sarah wrote with brutal honesty, describing the detention without sensationalizing it, explaining the political calculations that led to her erasure without excusing them. Some sections were difficult to read. The descriptions of isolation, of interrogation, of the slow psychological breakdown that came from being treated as a non-person. These passages had James in tears, but Sarah never wavered. She was determined to show the human cost of classified operations, the price paid by individuals sacrificed for abstract notions of national security. 5 days before the planned press conference, James received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. "Captain Mitchell," a woman's voice, professional and controlled. "This is Assistant Director Patricia Walsh from the FBI. We need to talk about Colonel Sarah Bennett." James's heart stopped. He put the call on speaker and made a gesture to Sarah, who was in the other room. She immediately came and sat beside him, her face unreadable. "I'm listening," James said carefully. "Colonel Bennett's activities over the past week have attracted our attention," Walsh said. "We're aware of the memoir project. We're aware of the planned press conference. We're concerned about potential violations of the Espionage Act, potential breaches of classified information protocols, and potential national security implications." And James asked, "And we'd like to meet with Colonel Bennett before she makes any irreversible decisions. We'd like to discuss what information she plans to release and what alternatives might exist that don't require public exposure." It was the carrot after the stick, the offer of a negotiation, of a possible way out that didn't involve prosecution or imprisonment. Sarah took the phone from James's hand. "Assistant Director Walsh," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for calling, but I'm not interested in alternative arrangements. I'm not interested in negotiations. I'm not interested in redacting my truth to fit the government's comfort level. I'll see you at the press conference. You can discuss the legal implications of my memoir with my attorneys." She hung up. James looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear. "That might have been a mistake," he said quietly. "No," Sarah replied. "That was the point at which I finally stopped making mistakes. That was the point at which I stopped trying to compromise with a system that never had any intention of compromising with me." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "2 more days," she said. "2 more days until the world knows that Phoenix didn't die in 1993. 2 more days until someone who was supposed to be erased becomes undeniably real." James stood beside her and they looked out at the future together. Uncertain, dangerous, but finally honest. The National Press Club in Washington, D.C. was packed with reporters, cameras, and the electricity of a story breaking in real time. It was 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Flight 447 had landed at Dulles. The news of Sarah's planned press conference had leaked early, creating a media frenzy. Every major outlet had sent representatives. The story, a dead pilot who'd been alive all along, a government cover-up spanning 3 decades, was too compelling to ignore. James stood backstage with Sarah, holding her hand. She was dressed in her Air Force dress uniform for the first time in 30 years. It still fit, though it hung slightly loose on her frame, evidence of the physical toll of 30 years in hiding. Her hair was pulled back in military regulation style. Her medals were pinned in perfect order. She looked like exactly what she was, a decorated officer who'd been erased and was finally coming back to life. "Last chance to change your mind," James said quietly. Sarah squeezed his hand. "I've had 30 years to change my mind. I'm not changing it now." She walked toward the stage, and James followed, taking a seat in the front row where the media could see him. He wanted them to know that a decorated Air Force captain was standing with her. He wanted them to understand that this wasn't a conspiracy theory or a delusion. This was a hero stepping back into the light. Sarah approached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. Cameras flashed. Reporters held up phones. The room went silent, waiting. "My name is Sarah Elizabeth Bennett," she began, her voice steady and clear. "My call sign was Phoenix. I was a colonel in the United States Air Force. I was declared killed in action in Bosnia in 1993. That was a lie." The room erupted. Reporters were already shouting questions, but Sarah raised her hand and they quieted. She possessed an authority that silence could not resist. "For the next 30 years, I lived under an assumed identity, Margaret Hayes, as the result of a classified prisoner exchange negotiated by the United States government. I was detained for 18 months in an undisclosed facility by Serbian forces after volunteering for a covert CIA extraction mission. When I was released, I was given a choice: remain erased or face prosecution and put my family at legal risk. I chose erasure." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "I made that choice believing I was being patriotic, believing that my sacrifice was necessary for national security, believing that silence was the right thing. But over 30 years, I learned that silence doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the systems that demand the silence." Sarah held up a copy of her memoir, leather-bound with a simple cover bearing her photograph from 1993, and the word Phoenix in bold letters. "This book is my truth. It details what happened to me, why it happened, and what it cost. I'm not revealing active intelligence operations. I'm not endangering current personnel. I'm not violating legitimate security protocols. But I am telling the story of one woman, and through that story, I'm asking the question: at what point does national security become an excuse for national injustice?" The reporters were already writing, already typing, already preparing their stories. Sarah had given them the headline they needed: "Dead pilot surfaces after 30 years, accuses government of forced erasure." "I want to acknowledge something," Sarah continued. "The government officials who made the decision to erase me, most of them were following orders. Most of them believed they were doing the right thing. General Raymond Harrison, who was instrumental in the operation that both saved my life and destroyed my identity, has issued a statement supporting the publication of this memoir. He believes, as I do, that the time has come for truth." James watched as General Harrison, sitting in the audience, nodded solemnly. His presence was powerful, an official acknowledgement of the government's role in Sarah's erasure. "This memoir is not a declaration of war against the military I served," Sarah said. "It's a plea for accountability. It's a demand that we treat human beings as more than tactical considerations. And it's the story of how one pilot learned that surviving isn't the same as living, that being alive isn't the same as existing, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fly a helicopter into enemy fire. It's tell the truth about what was done to you." She set down her speech and spoke directly to the cameras without notes. "I want to address Captain James Mitchell, who's here today. James, you were a young officer when you served under me in Bosnia. You didn't have to stand with me these past 3 weeks. You didn't have to violate protocol, put your career at risk, or choose loyalty over duty. You did it anyway. Because you remembered who I was when the whole world was pretending I never existed. Thank you. That decision, your decision to see me as human instead of as a classified problem, that's what allowed me to finally see myself that way again. James felt tears streaming down his face, uncaring that hundreds of cameras were pointed at him. And I want to address everyone else, Sarah continued. If you're watching this and you've ever been told to stay silent about injustice, that your voice doesn't matter, that speaking truth will only make things worse, I'm here to tell you that silence costs more than honesty ever could. I'm here to tell you that a life lived in the shadows isn't a life at all. I'm here to tell you that redemption and reclamation are possible, even after 30 years of being erased. She held up the book again. This memoir goes on sale tomorrow. I'm donating all proceeds to organizations that work with detained persons, that fight for government accountability, and that support military personnel who have been wrongfully treated by the system they served. Phoenix is flying again, not in aircraft, but in words, in truth, in legacy. The press conference descended into controlled chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Sarah's lawyers stepped forward to explain the process, to answer legal questions, to begin the machinery of accountability. But Sarah's final words had already been delivered. What followed was exactly what everyone had predicted, and nothing like what anyone expected. The government didn't prosecute. The Department of Justice reviewed the memoir and determined that while controversial, it didn't violate classified information protocols. The memoir became a bestseller, translated into 14 languages, taught in military academies as a case study in government accountability. But more importantly, it changed something deeper. It cracked open the conversation about what it meant to sacrifice for a country and what a country owed in return. 3 months after the press conference, Sarah and James sat together in her new home, a small house in Maryland, filled with sunlight, with no name on the mailbox, with a front door she didn't have to hide behind. She wasn't invisible anymore. She'd reclaimed her identity completely. She'd returned to active Air Force duty in an advisory capacity, helping develop protocols for treating military personnel who'd been detained or subject to classified operations. "Do you regret any of it?" James asked one evening as they watched the sunset. "Which part?" Sarah smiled. "The 30 years of hiding, no, that was necessary and I survived it. The decision to break 30 years of silence, also no, that was overdue. The decision to put my trust in you, never. That was the best decision I've made." She leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd honored a debt that transcended time, protocol, and classified systems. "Do you know what I realized?" Sarah said finally. "I spent 30 years thinking that my survival was the victory, but the real victory was always about being remembered, being seen, being real to at least one person who mattered. That's what changed everything for me." James squeezed her hand. Phoenix had finally landed. Not in a helicopter, not in an aircraft, not even in a physical sense, but in the only place that truly mattered, in truth, in memory, in the hearts of the people she'd refused to let forget her. And her story would endure, long after the classified documents were declassified, long after the government officials retired, long after the memorial service was revealed as a lie. Because some stories, once told, can never be silenced again.